Hey, and welcome back to another video. So in today's video, we're actually going to look at how we can actually build an app using Firebase, for our SDK that allows us to basically register, reset our password, log in, and also handle state management. By state management, I mean once you log into the app, you get presented with the actual main screen within the application, and when you log out, you get taken back to the screen where you can actually log in or register or do whatever you want to do with your account. So in this video, we're actually going to bypass setting up Firebase in our SwiftUI app. Now, I've already done a video, which I'll link at the top if you want to check that out. And that actually goes through how to set up Firebase in your SwiftUI app. But in order to do this video, there's a few things you'll need to get started. So the first thing you'll need is you're going to need to have the Firebase Auth package, which you can get via Swift Package Manager. And then what you'll also need is you'll also need a Firebase database product. And then finally, what you'll also need to do is you'll need to make sure that your project that you're working with is linked to Firebase. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here about what each one of these products are. We'll discuss that later on in the video. But what we're going to do now is we're going to jump into the console and we're just going to do some extra setup and configuration and discuss them a bit more. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So as you can see here, I've actually got my, console set up and whatnot. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to work with authentication. So basically, if you want to allow users to log in and register via your app, you have to actually enable and actually use the Firebase Auth product. So what we're going to do is do that first. So in order to do that, in your console, you'll see an option under the build category called authentication. All you need to do is select that. And then when you select that, what you need to do is obviously, if you've not done this before, then hit get started. And then what this will do is it'll basically give you a list of all the different possible sign-in providers that you could use. Now, for this, we're just going to be using email and password. So we want to click on the first one. So once you basically clicked on this option, you have to enable it. And there's actually an additional option here if you actually want to allow people to sign in using a magic link. So if someone gets an email, they'll tap the link and it automatically logs you in the app. We're not going to be doing that in this tutorial. But if you are interested in me doing it, then leave a comment in the comment section below and I'll show you how to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit save. And then now we've enabled auth for our application. So we're allowing people to authenticate themselves. Now, the next thing we need to do, because we actually want to store some custom data with users when they register, is we actually need to enable the Firebase database. So in order to do that, again, on the build, we need to go to Realtime database and select that. Once we finish selecting that, we actually need to create a database. We'll get a couple of options. So you can choose where you want your database location to be. Now, for this, I'm just going to choose US Central because it's not too important for what I'm trying to do. And you actually get two options. So you actually get the option to actually start this in locked mode. And you also have an option to start in test mode. Now, I'm not going to go into too much again about this, but essentially, locked mode basically means it's completely locked off. So people cannot read or write to your database. And test mode essentially means that anyone can basically do anything. So let's enable this. Now it's not too important what option you selected then, because what we're going to do is we're actually going to add our own rule in. So what you need to do is you need to go to rules. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to basically get a gist on my GitHub page and paste it in here. So this is the gist. So basically, this gist allows people to read and write to the Firebase database if it's their data. So if it's just their data, they can change it. They can't change anyone else's. So we're going to copy this gist, and as usual, I'll leave a link to this in the description box. And all we're going to do is just paste this in here. And then what we're going to do is we're basically going to just publish this. All right, cool. And now we've actually set up the rules for our real-time database. All right, cool. So like I mentioned at the start, we said we're going to handle the state, so session state management. So if someone logs in or someone logs out, we want to change the view that gets presented within the app. So in order to do this, what we're going to do is we're actually going to need to almost have a container view, which basically allows us to hold our two views that we want to have and switch between them. So in our case, our container view that we are going to be using is essentially just going to be our navigation view. So our navigation view essentially acts as the container for our child views. And one of the child views that we're actually going to have is basically a view for when the user has logged out. So whenever the user logs out, what we're going to do is we're basically going to show a view for the logged out state. Now that view is going to basically be the login screen because you've logged out. So once someone has logged in, alternatively, we're going to show another view, which is the logged in view. And this screen is going to be the main screen in our app, which will basically hold the user's details and information about them. So what happens if someone's either logged in or logged out? Then once those changes happen with our state, we're basically just going to basically switch between the two views and update the UI within our app. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to write out the SwiftUI code that resembles this. And we're just going to basically start off by just starting off with our login view and building the components that we need for this as well. So let's do that now. Cool. So now let's create a new folder called feature. And essentially the purpose of this folder is to hold all the features that we're going to be building on. So in the feature folder, we'll create another group specifically just for login. Let's do that now. And then we'll also create another group in here called view. And then this is where we'll build our login view component. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So we've added that in now. So now what we need to do is we actually need to use this login view component in the main part of our app. So let's go to our main part of our app here. And rather than us having a content view, what we're going to do is we're going to basically delete this line. And then we're just going to have our navigation view. And then within our navigation view, we're going to add our login view. Cool. And we don't actually need this content view file anymore because we're not going to be using it. So what we can do is we can actually delete this file just to keep it clean, and then cool. So we've got the base set up. So what we want to do now is we actually want to build the components that our app uses. So our app actually has quite a few components that are on the same screen. So for example, text fields, buttons, and whatnot. So let's look at our app and see how we can actually break this down into which components and what we need to build. So like I mentioned before, our app has quite a few components. And if you just look at the design on the screen here, these are the screens that we're going to be building. So we're going to have a login screen, main content view, reset password, and register screen. So as you can see, there's quite a few components that actually get repeated here. Now, what we wouldn't want to do is actually basically build this out every single time because no one's got time for that. So instead of doing that, what we're going to do is we're actually going to build components and extract these into their own views so we can actually reuse them easily and quickly. So if you just look at the screen, the first component that we're going to look at building is a text component. So if you look on the login screen and also the reset password and register screen, you'll see that there's email fields, there's a first name, last name, and a occupation. So it makes sense to have a text component that accepts all these different types of inputs. Now, the next component that we're going to basically build is a password input. So if you look on our login screen and register screen, you'll see that we actually have a password field. Now you might be wondering, why am I not just using a text input field for that? Well, the reason is because if we use a text field, what would happen is that the password that someone types in would visually be exposed. So by you having a separate component just for password input, we can ensure that the content that someone types in is securely protected. And then finally, the last component that we need to build is our button. So as you can see on all the screens, we have a button and we have a primary button that's in blue. But you can also see that we also have a button that's in white. So we need to actually build a button that is easily configurable. So let's look at doing this now. So the first one we're going to tackle out of these three components is the text input. All right, cool. So like I mentioned a second ago, we're actually going to tackle building our text input. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder here called base. And what is the purpose of base? So basically, base holds all of our base components, extensions, modifiers that we would easily reuse. So it's not something that's specific to a feature. It's more where we put common stuff that are helpers for us. So inside of base, we're going to basically create a new group. I'm going to go call this views. And then inside of views, we're going to create a new component called text input. All right, cool. Now I'm just going to give this view some properties and then break down the purpose of what these properties are. Cool. So let's just break this down. So our first property that I typed out was text. So essentially the reason why we need this is because we actually need to bind this value to our text field when someone's typing. So the next property that we have, or constant I should say, is our placeholder. So in our text field, we're going to allow someone to add a placeholder if they want to. And then we also are going to allow the user to actually add a keyboard type. So there's different types of keyboards. So you could have a keyboard type specifically for email address, or you could just use the normal default keyboard. And then what we're going to do is we're actually going to allow a user to basically choose an SF symbol if they want to add an icon into the text field. So I've added an extra property here that's actually private and closed off. And the reason why this is closed off is because this is what we're going to use to actually manage and handle the layout for where our symbol is positioned in our text field. And then finally, we actually have our input text field view here. And as you can see, I've actually constructed it with some dummy placeholder values so we can see this in our preview whilst we build it. So the next bit I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do some typing and actually write out our actual text field, and then we're going to break down the styles that I've actually applied to it. All right, cool. So now let's break this down. So essentially, we've got a text field, as you can see here, and we pass in our placeholder that I mentioned before, and we actually bind it to our text property so we can actually get the value that someone's typing in. We set some frames, so we set the max width to be infinity, so it fills the entire, container. And we also give it a minimum height of 44. Then what we do is we give it some padding on the left-hand side. So depending on if there is an SF symbol or not, we will actually change where the padding for our text field is. So if there isn't an FS symbol, then obviously we'll reduce the padding. And if there is, then we'll increase it so that we can add our SF symbol onto the left-hand side. Then we set the keyboard type depending on the configuration that someone's passed in. Finally, what we do is in our background, we actually have a Z stack, which is what we use to basically show our SF symbol and also as well to apply our border around our text field. So that's what we basically got. So you may be wondering, why have I not just used border and why have I used rounded rectangle? Well, the reason why is because I feel like using rounded rectangle, in my opinion, with a background just gives me a lot more control over the styles and the configuration for it. All right, cool. So you can also see as well that we actually do some optional chaining. And if there is a SF symbol, then what we'll do is we're basically going to set it to an image, and that image is going to basically be positioned here, as you can see here, which we give a font, some padding, and a foreground color. So what I actually want to do is, now that we've broken this down, is I actually want to basically make this look more like what the component will look like, because currently if you look at it, it's just basically in an iPhone, and I just prefer to make it look like the component. What we're going to do is on here, we're just going to basically add some modifiers to basically make it look more like the component. All right, cool. So what I actually want to do is I actually want to basically preview what this will look like if I basically have another component that doesn't have an actual icon. So let's do that now. So once to do that, we're just going to basically click on the actual input text field view in here, and we're just going to embed it in a group. And then rather than saying email, we'll just change to something like first name. We'll set our keyboard type to default. And we'll also set our SF symbol to nil, as well as changing our description. All right, cool. So as you can see, this is what our component looks like. If I just zoom in. As you can see, this is what our component looks like. But have you noticed an issue? So as you can see, we've actually repeated ourselves here twice. Now, rather than doing this is something that we're going to be doing a lot throughout the video. So rather than doing this, where we actually manually type this every single time, what we actually should do is actually create a modifier so we can basically reuse these preview layouts. and we can easily preview our components within the SwiftUI previews. So let's do that now. So what we're going to do is we're basically going to go to our base, and we're now going to create a brand new folder called modifier. And within our modifier folder, we're going to basically create a preview layout components modifier. As you can see, this is just an empty Swift file. So in order to basically build this custom modifier, we actually need to import SwiftUI so we can actually use the view modifier protocol. All right, cool. And when you actually use the view modifier protocol, you basically get this function body here, where this allows you to actually change the view that you're basically using this modifier on. So what we want to do is we basically want to actually, if you look at our example from before, we actually want to allow the person to basically pass in the name for this modifier. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're basically going to copy these modifiers from here first, and we're just going to basically use this on our content and create a property that allows someone to actually inject a name for this. All right, cool. So now we've got our constant for holding a name for our component that we're going to be adding into our preview. What we need to do now is we actually need to basically create an extension so we can actually use this as a modifier in line with other ones. So let's do that now. So as you can see here, we've got our extension and we've got our function called preview with name, where we'll actually pass in a name for our modifier that we'll be using here, and we'll basically return some view. So that some view being the view that we applied the modifier on, and then we'll actually use the self.modifier function to basically apply this preview layout component modifier onto itself. So now let's actually use this on our view. So if you just go to back to your input text field views previews, if you basically just after this just basically say dot preview with, and then we'll just copy the display name from here and paste it to here. All right, cool. So if we hit resume, because unfortunately I haven't got an M1 Mac, so if we hit resume and it basically reloads, you'll see that our previews look the exact same, and we've actually managed to stop ourselves from duplicating code. All right, cool. So the next modifier that we need to actually build is our password input. So let's do that now. So what we need to do is, again, in our views, we'll create a new view called input password view. So let's do that. All right, cool. And similar to our text field input view, but there's a few minor differences. So we actually have a binding property to basically get our password from the view that we'll be using in a second. We've also got a placeholder again for the component, and also we've given the person the option to use a system image if they want to use a system image. And we've obviously set this up in our previews. So now let's actually add in this view now. All right, cool. So now we've done that. And as you can see, it's very similar to our view from before. So we have a binding for our password, which is going to be hold a string. So this is what we're going to use for our component to basically capture the input and store it. We'll have a placeholder for the placeholder, and we have a SF symbol if we actually want to add an icon onto the screen. Now you'll see obviously we set up the preview as well with some default, values so we can see it in the previews as well. But what we're also going to do now is we're going to basically add in our view, and then we're basically going to discuss and break down the layout for it. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So let's just break this down. So like I said before, when we talk about the components, we're not actually going to use a text field for this one. We're actually going to use a secure field, which allows us to actually secure the input that someone actually types in. So we pass in our placeholder like we did before, and we bind it to our password here. We also apply some sizing onto the field. And again, we do the padding with the layout like we did before, the exact same. And then similarly, again, we do the exact same thing where we add a background onto the text field with a image and a rounded rectangle. So as you can see, because I passed in the SF symbol lock, you can actually see the lock icon here. So one last thing we're going to do is we're actually going to use our modifier from before to actually preview what this looks like. So in here, we're just going to basically say, all right, cool. And as you can see, we've now got our two components in terms of what they look like when they do have a password. When they do have a SF symbol and when they don't have an SF symbol. So this looks so good. So we now have one final component to build, and that's our button component. So let's do that now. Cool. So ignore the error for now. We'll deal with that in a second. But what I want to do is I just wanted to go through the properties again. So this time we actually have a type alias. So the reason why we have a type alias is so we can actually make the purpose of our closure more, clear in terms of what its purposes. And then we have a title property, well, title constant to basically hold the title that will show on the button, the background for the background of it, the foreground for the foreground color, so the text color. We also have a border, so a border that we're going to apply around it, and we also have a handler, so we can actually assign a action for our button when someone taps it. Okay, cool. So finally, what we're going to do now is we're basically going to create an initializer. So when someone actually builds this component, they don't actually have to actually give it a style. It actually has some default styles already. So let's do that now. So in order to do that, if you just hold down Command on your keyboard and then just basically click on button component view, and then you'll see an option here called generate member-wise initializer. Now you could type this out manually if you wanted to, but I'm lazy, so I'm not doing that. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy the initializer and then just paste it below our properties. And I'm just going to basically just get some spare spaces. Okay, cool. And now what we're going to do is we're basically going to give some of our properties a default value. So let's do that now. Cool. So now our properties have a default value, so we don't really need to specify every single property now. By every single property, I mean we don't need to specify a background, foreground, and border. Instead, we need to actually set a title, and we also have to use our handler as well. So let's go into our previews, and what we're going to do is we're just going to basically add in a title. I'm just going to call this login, and then we're going to add in our handler, like so. All right, cool. So now the error's gone away. Okay, sweet. So now what we need to do is we actually need to add in our button and the styles that we're going to apply onto that. So let's do that now. All right, okay, cool. So what we've actually done now is essentially we basically pass in our handler to our action. So whenever we actually tap the button, it will actually trigger our closure that we basically set up in via our initializer. We also have a label. So we also have our label here. So we actually have our text in here with some title and a frame. And now we give it a max width of infinity, so we basically ensure that our button fills the whole screen, and also a maximum height of 50, so it can't get larger than 50. We also give it a background using our background property, foreground using the foreground property. We apply a font onto it using, system size 16 and bold. We have a property called corner radius, which is what we used to apply corner radius onto this. I know at the time of this recording, I know that Apple released ways to style these buttons a bit better, but I did this, obviously Xcode 13 isn't out, but when the time comes, I'll do a video on it. We also apply an overlay onto the button. So if we want to basically have a button with like just a border around it, and we can simulate that with a rounded rectangle and our stroke as well. So one thing that I actually want us to do is I basically want to actually, first of all, I just want to rename this because I feel like this might be a bit long. So let's rename this to just button view. All right, cool. So obviously make sure button view is being renamed here, and also your previews now says button view underscore previews. And what we're going to do now is we're going to use the same modifier again to preview what this looks like. So I'm actually going to change the title here from login to primary, just to say that this is what the primary button looks like. And then we're just going to say dot preview, and then we're just going to say primary view, and then we're going to create a group for this button. And I'm just going to give this secondary button a bit more styles to make it look like a secondary button. So let's do that. All right, cool. And as you can see now, we have our primary button and our secondary button. So we now have all our components built. We can actually start to build the screens in our app. So the first screen that we're actually going to tackle building is our login view. So let's do that now. So let's go back to the login view that we actually created before. And this time we're actually going to add in our components that we built previously. So let's go into here. I'm just going to zoom out a bit, and I'm just going to basically just add in a few things. All right, cool. So let's go through this now. So basically, we have our VStack, which is what's going to hold all our components that we build, and we add in some padding to the left and right hand side to basically push everything inside, from the edges. And then finally, we add a navigation title onto login. Now, you won't actually see this if you don't add in the navigation view in the preview. The reason why I've not added a navigation view in the body is because if you remember before when I was talking about how we're going to handle the session state management, we're basically going to have that navigation view as our container for our two views that will basically be switched in and out. So we don't want to use a navigation view here. We want to basically use it at the root, which essentially to control which view it appears on the screen. So that's why we need to use a navigation view in our preview to see what it looks like. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add in our login and pause. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add in our email and password to the login screen. So let's do that. Cool. And the reason why I've used a VStack here is because I want to basically control and get greater control over the components, and it also allows me to basically group them together nicely if I want to add individual spacing, like I said a second ago. So the next thing that we need to do is add in our forgot password underneath the VStack. So let's do that now. Cool. And we basically got a H stack. And the reason why we use a H stack is because if we don't add in a H stack, essentially our button would just be in the center. So we want to use a H stack to basically horizontally align our views and then add in a spacer so we can push our view to the right hand side. All right, cool. Now, obviously, if you don't want to do that and you want it in the center, then just take this out. And then finally, what we need to do is add in our buttons. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. And similar again, we've got our VStack here, spacing, so we can control the spacing between them if we need to. And then we basically got our button view. So we got one for login and we got one for register, our secondary button, which allows us to basically have, more configurations and styles on it. So what we're going to do now is just to show you this as well, is we're just going to preview what this actually looks like on a small device to make sure that it still looks good. So I'm just going to change this to an iPhone 8. And as you can see, our screen looks fine on an iPhone 8 as well. So it will scale great. So the next screen that we wanted to tackle essentially is we actually want to look at building our registration view. So let's do that now. So if you just go into feature, we'll create a new folder called register. And then within register, we'll create a new folder called view. And then this is where we're basically going to build our register view. Okay, cool. So what we've got here is we've basically got a navigation view in our register view this time. And why have we got a navigation view in this one and we didn't use it before? Well, essentially, register view isn't actually going to be one of the views that gets changed between when our user session state changes. This is basically just an independent view that we're going to basically show on the screen when someone taps a button. So it's completely separate from the session state. So technically, it does need a navigation view to basically present a title on the screen. So we've added in a navigation view, and we've also got a VStack again, and exactly the same stylings. So what we actually need to do now, because we're going to be presenting this register view from the bottom, we need to basically provide the user a way to easily close this if they don't want to swipe it down. So we're going to actually add a X icon into the top right hand side of the screen. Let's do that now. All right, okay, cool. So what we've basically done now is we basically added a button onto the top right hand side. But how did we do that? So in SwiftUI, there's a toolbar modifier that allows you to add buttons into a toolbar. So by default, this setup that I'm basically using here just adds it here. And in our toolbar, we basically added a button, and I'll get onto this in a second, but we've also used a image, an SF symbol, X mark, to basically add that onto the screen. So what is this if you've never saw this before? So basically this presentation mode allows us to actually access the environment's presentation. We can basically handle either dismissing a view that's been presented from the bottom or a view that's been pushed. So this is how you actually handle dismissing screens in SwiftUI. So we're actually going to access the presentation mode in the environment, and then using our variable, which is using the environment property wrapper, we're basically going to get the wrap value and call the dismiss function to dismiss the screen depending on how it was presented. So now if you actually look at this, we actually do have another screen which actually is going to have another close button, which is our forgot password screen. So I actually don't want to have to repeat this modifier multiple times. So what we'll do is we'll actually move this out into its own modifier, similar to what we did with the previews. So let's do that now. So let's go into our base, and in our modifier, we'll create a new file called close modifier. All right, okay, cool. And as you can see, what we've done is we basically copied over our environment property wrapper, which we use to handle the presentation, and we've applied a toolbar modifier onto the view that will basically use this modifier. So let's use this now. So we need to actually use the function called apply close. So if we go back to our register, we can now actually delete this at the top now and our toolbar, and we can just basically just call that apply close. Cool. And as you can see in our preview, we still got our close button, which is what we need. So now what we need to do is we actually need to add in the fields that we want to allow someone to basically enter in to create their email, password, and we're actually going to collect some custom data from them, such as their first name, last name, and their occupation. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So now we've got the email and password. What I actually want to do is I actually don't want to have too many, fields. I actually want to basically make it seem like there's two different types of content that you need to fill in. So in order to actually separate these two sections, you could say, I'm actually going to basically use a divider. So let's do that now. Cool. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically use the input text field view for our first name, last name, and occupation. So let's do that now. Cool. And as you can see, we've now got the first name, last name, occupation. Now, the reason why I added all these text fields inside of another VStack is because underneath this VStack, I actually want to actually add a button that isn't part of this list here. So what I'm going to do is outside of this VStack, we're going to add a button view below this so someone can actually tap that and register if they want to. So let's do that. Sweet. So now we've got our register screen. And again, if we run it, go to the iPhone 8 on the preview and actually preview what it looks like. It looks perfect. So we've actually got two more screens to build now. So the next screen we're going to build is basically our main screen, which is basically essentially when someone actually logs in successfully or registers successfully and accesses our application. So let's do that now. So in our feature folder, let's create a new group called home. And then we'll also create another new group called view. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to basically call this view our home view. Okay, sweet. And similar to before, this is another view that's basically going to be used to basically switch between our login view and when someone's logged in and someone logged out for our session. So we don't actually want to wrap this view in a navigation view, and we want to actually use the navigation view in the preview so we can see what the title will look like. Okay, sweet. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to add in some views here. So let's do that now. Cool. So this is what we're going to basically use. So we're going to have some text fields here to basically get the user's information. And then we're also going to have a log out button so someone can actually log out on this screen if they want to simulate logging out in the app. All right, cool. So the final screen we need to build is our forgot password view. So let's do that now. So again, we're going to create a new feature, forgot password, and the same structure. Basically have a navigation view for this view because again, it's not part of the view that we're going to use to handle our session. And then within our navigation view, we just add in the same styles again, and we also apply the close button using our modifier. So this screen is a bit different. So I actually do want to add in the environment property wrapper. And the reason why that is because when we actually move on to adding in Combine for actually sending the request of using Firebase to reset the password, I actually don't want someone to press close to manually close the view. When we basically execute the action, I actually want to manually dismiss the screen. And the reason why that is because this screen is basically a fire and forget screen. So what do I mean by that? So essentially what I mean is that if the request is successful or unsuccessful, when you send a request to reset your password, I don't really care about the, the outcome. I just basically just want to send a request, and if it works, the user will get an email. If it doesn't work, then they just won't get an email. So we can just basically close the screen. So I'm going to actually add in the environment property wrapper in here so we can actually do that. So let's do that now. And then finally, we'll actually add in the remaining components for the screen. So now that we've actually built our screens, what we need to do now is actually add in the logic to actually present them using state variables. So let's do that now. So the first screen, or the main screen that you'll see when you actually open up the app for the first time, is the login screen. So that's the main screen where we're actually going to be using our state variables to actually control and handle, navigation between different screens. So let's go to our logins view. What we're actually going to do is we're actually going to tackle presenting our register view from the bottom. So we're going to create a state variable for that. So we've got our state variable here called show registration, which is what we're going to use with our sheet modifier in a second to basically handle presentation. So what we want to do is when someone actually taps the register button, we actually want to toggle this value to true. So let's look for the button. So if you just scroll down, you'll see that we left a comment here to say handle registration. All right, cool. So now this will actually toggle out to true. So now when we go back, so now on our button view, what we want to do is we actually want to use the sheet modifier to basically present our register view from the bottom. So let's do that now. Okay, sweet. So now what we've done is we're basically binding our show registration to the sheet modifier, and depending on whether this is true or false, so if this is true, this will actually trigger and actually show our content being the register view. So what we'll do now is we'll just test this out quickly to see if it works fine. So let's just click on the play button, and now if you tap on register, you'll see that it shows the register screen. And if you tap on the close button, you'll see that it automatically closes our view. Perfect. So now the next one we need to handle is forgot password. So we're going to do the exact same thing again. So let's go up and create another state variable called show forgot password. And we're going to toggle this in our show forgot password action. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a sheet modifier on our button again to basically handle presenting the forgot password screen. All right, cool. So now let's resume this. Now let's test forgot password. Awesome. You see we got our reset password screen. When you hit close, it closes it. Now you may be wondering, why did I not just apply the sheet modifier like outside here and just doing one after the other? Well, I do know that from iOS 14.5, they've actually fixed it in this version of Xcode. So Xcode 12.5, you're using 14.5. You can apply multiple sheet modifiers onto the same view. But the reason why we're doing it like this is in the event that someone has our app on the phone and they don't have that OS version, so we don't actually introduce bugs into our app. All right, cool. So now that we've actually handled navigation, the next thing I want to do before we start using some combine and handle login, registration, all that stuff, is I actually want to discuss the architecture that we're actually going to be using in this project. So let's go to the graphic now. So essentially, for our architecture, we're going to be using MVVM. So what we're actually going to have is we're basically going to have a class called a service, and what the purpose of this service class is basically to publish the result that we get back from Firebase. So what do I mean by that? So let's say, for example, if someone registers a new account or if someone logs in, the purpose of this service is to basically tell us whether that was successful or if there was a failure. Then after our service class, we're actually basically going to have a view model. So our view model is basically going to subscribe to the value that basically gets published from our service. So if our login or registration was either successful or there was a failure, we'll actually handle it in our view model and actually subscribe to these changes. Then what we're going to basically do is we're basically going to use our view model to essentially publish events. So we're actually going to have some published properties that basically publish whether there was an error or, like I said before, a success. And in order to do this, we're actually going to use a enum to basically drive events to and update our UI. So any UI updates are going to basically happen because they will be subscribing and bound to the published properties that we have in our view model. So the first one we're actually going to tackle is our registration view. So let's actually look at how we can do that now. All right, cool. So what we're going to do is in our register folder, we're going to create a new folder called model. And this is basically going to be the model that we use to basically gather all the registration information. Right, okay, cool. So we basically got a struct registration details and it has a bunch of variables. And the reason why we're using variables here and not constant is because we actually want to bind these later on to our text field and secure text entry field. So by making them variables, we can basically change the values and store them at the same time within our struct. So what we need to do now is basically create our service class, which is essentially going to use this struct to basically register a new user. So let's do that now. So in register, we'll create a new group called service, and then we'll create a new file called registration service. And what I'm just going to do is I'm going to type out a protocol to basically just define the implementation for this class. Okay, cool. So now what we're going to do is we're going to import a few frameworks, and I'm going to change the signature of this function and we'll break it down. Okay, cool. So what we've basically done now is we've imported Combine and Firebase database. So we've actually changed the signature of our register function. So before we were just registering with the details being the struct value, the struct that we're basically going to pass in. But now we've actually got a return type, any publisher, and it's voiding error. So what does this mean? So essentially what we're saying here is we're basically going to return a publisher that we can subscribe to. And if it's successful, the result, then we're going to return void. Now, the reason why we're returning void is because if someone successfully registers, we don't really need to return anything back because we don't get anything back from that. But what we do want to do is if there is an error, then we want to throw back a error. So now we've actually got a final class, and we're basically saying here that the registration service implementation should use our protocol. The reason why we've marked it final is because we don't want any other class to be able to subclass this class. And now we need to actually write out the logic and create our publisher so that you can actually register an account. So in order to do this, we're actually going to be using deferred and future in Combine to basically allow us to basically create a publisher and handle whether we actually get a success or failure from Firebase. So let's type it out now. All right, cool. So now we've defined our deferred and future. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about what these mean in this video, but if you are interested, I actually do have a video where we actually do break this down called Learning Combined with Practical Examples, which I'll link in the description box and also add a card to at the top here. So what we're basically saying here is we actually want to receive our publisher on the main thread. And the reason why that is because we actually want to make sure that any responses that we receive back from Firebase is back on the main thread, so we can actually do any UI work on the main thread. And we just basically use this erase to any publisher to basically turn this into a generic publisher. So in order to actually basically create a new user, if you just look at the documentation, Firebase actually has a function here called create user with email, password, and that'll actually allow you to basically create the user within the authentication feature that we set up before. So let's actually type this out now. Okay, cool. So we'll type this out now, and you'll see that you have an error because it can't find auth in scope. And the reason why that is because we actually need to import Firebase. And then now that'll work. So what we're basically saying here is we're just basically going to pass in some details and create a new user. And when we actually get the callback from Firebase, we're actually going to check if there's an error. If there is an error, then we're going to use our future to push that error through. So we're unwrapping the error, and then we're just going to basically push the error so we can subscribe to any errors that we receive. So within our else statement, this basically means that we successfully created that user. So now what we need to do, we need to actually create the user with the additional data that we actually have in registration details. So in order to do that, we actually have to use the Firebase real-time database function to basically associate this data with that user. So in order to do that, we actually need to have a set of keys because to associate data, it actually works with a dictionary. So let's create an enum that basically allows us to specify the keys that we actually want to use so we don't actually create any like typos or whatnot. So what I'm going to do is at the top here, above my protocol, I'm going to just define an enum. Cool. So these are the values or the keys that we're basically going to be storing in Firebase. So we're going to store first name, which will have a value, last name, and occupation. So we now actually need to use this. So let's type that out now. Right, cool. So what we're basically saying here is from the result that we get back from the user that we created, we want to basically get their user ID. And if we can unwrap this safely, then we're going to basically create a dictionary for the values that we're actually going to store in Firebase, or else we're going to push back an error. So a failure here that basically just says there's an invalid user ID. So what we need to do now in here, after we've set up our dictionary, is we basically need to use the Firebase database function to basically update our user with these values. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So now we're accessing a database. We're basically referencing it. We're getting our table, you could say, users, and we're going to basically create a child node in this with the user's ID so we can associate that data to the user. And then we're going to update the child's value, the values in this database with the values that we created. And if there isn't an error, if there is an error, then we're going to push the error. And if there isn't an error, then we're just going to push success. And then we're going to basically send back void. So we're just going to handle it like that. So now we've actually wrote out our function for basically handling the users creation. We need to basically actually use this class within our view model. So now let's go into our register folder and we'll create a new group and we'll just call this view model. And then within this folder, we're going to create a new file called registration view model. And then like I mentioned in the presentation before, we're basically going to have enums that allow us to handle the event or the state of whether something was successful or if it failed. So let's define that enum now. So we basically got our enum and we basically got a case for successful, we've got a case for failed, and we've also got a case called NA, which essentially means not available, so there isn't anything available. So what we need to do now is we need to define the protocol, which is our implementation, and some other properties and initializers for our view model. So let's do that now. All right, okay, cool. So in our protocol, we've got a function to handle registering. We've also got a property here, which we're basically going to use for injecting and using our service. We've got another property here for handling the state changes within our view model. We've got another property here, userDetails, which is what we're going to use to bind the text field input to our view model. And we've got our initializer here, so we can actually inject our service into our view model. So this is everything that we've defined here. So now what we need to do is actually write out our view model and actually use our protocol implementation. Right, cool. So now we've actually got our class here. So we've basically got our service. We've also got our state, which at the moment is NA. And we've also got our user details, as you can see, which basically have a registration details where none of the information has actually been filled in because obviously we've not received this yet. We've also got our initializer where we inject our service into, and finally we've got our register function, which is what we're going to use to actually register a user. Now the reason why we're not passing in our user details via the register functions because we're going to actually bind the user details to our view. So because it's bound to our view, the register will basically just call an action and use the property within this class. But I do think we can actually improve this registration details, and rather than having to type out all these parameters, what about if we just had a computer property that just basically did this for us? So let's do that now. So let's go into registration details, and I'm going to create an extension on it. And I'm just going to basically create a computer property called new. And I'm going to copy this and then place it inside my computer property. And I'm also going to mark this static, so we don't need to initialize it. Awesome. So now if we go back to here, we can just do registration details dot new. Sweet, nice. So now what we actually need to do is actually use our service in our register function to basically listen to the value that gets published. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So let's just actually look at this and then we'll break it down. So we basically call our register function, which is a publisher, So we sync, so we basically get the value from our publisher, and based on the result of when this completes, or if we get an error, we'll change the state. So if there's an error, we're going to set the state and we're going to change the state to failed. If we receive a value, so that means basically if we receive like a success and everything was fine, then we're actually going to set our state to successful, which I spelled wrong. So let's go to the email and add in the extra L. Cool. And then what we do finally is we store it in our set of any cancellables, as you can see here, which we've marked as private. So we define this here. All right, cool. So now what we need to do is we actually need to use this view model in our register view. So let's do that now. So if you go into your register view, we're actually going to create a state object at the top in our struct to basically hold our view model. So let's do that now. So we've created our state object here, and as you can see, we've actually got an error. Now, why have we got this error? Well, the reason being is because we can't actually use state object or any of these other, property wrappers that handle data in SwiftUI or data flow without marking our class as an observable object. So let's go into our view model, and then what we'll do is here, we'll basically mark this as an observable object. Cool. And now, if you go back to the view and we just build it, you'll see that the error goes away. So as you can see in our view model, we're actually also injecting in our service implementation via the view model initializer. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to use our view model to actually bind the input from these text fields to the user details. So the first one we're going to do is email. So in the text here, we're just going to type it out. And what we're basically saying here is we're binding the view model and we're going to access the user details and then access email. So within our struct, so this is what's going to bind it. So now let's copy this and now let's use it here. And then we'll go change that to password and then we'll go do that for the rest of them. So this will be first name. Right, cool. So you can see here we're binding the email, password, first name, last name, and occupation. And then finally what we need to do is in our button, we need to basically handle essentially when someone taps it, the creation of the account. So we're just going to say here, view model, VM dot register. Cool. Sweet. So now we could test this out, but what I actually want to do is I actually want to show you what it will look like for a user who registers, and what will happen is that Firebase will actually automatically log them in. So in order for us to do this, what we're going to do is we're actually going to handle the session state now before we actually test this out, and then once we finish doing the session state, we'll then handle login, and then we'll do forgot password last. So now what we're going to do is we're going to basically create a new group in our feature, and we're going to call this session. And then we're going to create a model, and then we're going to create a new struct called user details. And we're going to create a new struct called session user details. All right, cool. And as you can see on our struct, we basically got the first name, last name, occupation. So the reason why we have these as constants and not variables is because this isn't something we're actually going to kind of bind to or change. It's just something that's going to be used to essentially push out the current user details for the session that the user is currently on. So what we're going to do now is we're basically going to create our service class, which basically is going to handle the Firebase Auth listener for listening to when a user session has changed. So that could mean either someone's logged in or someone's logged out. So we're going to create a new folder here called service. And we're going to call this session service. So what we need now is we basically need an enum to basically tell us the current session state, so whether someone's logged in or logged out. So let's create an enum for that. And now what we'll do is we'll create our protocol, which will define our implementation. Right, okay, cool. So now what we've got is we've got our state. So this is our session state. We've actually got our user details. So I've marked this as optional because obviously until you log in, this is going to be nil. We've also got log out, which is what we're going to use to handle logging someone out as well. So what we need to do now is actually implement this within our service class. Let's do that now. Okay, cool. So we've marked these two as published, and the reason why that is because we're going to actually use these later to basically use this to listen to changes, and if there are changes, to change, so redraw our view. So what we need to do now is, if we actually just look at the Firebase documentation, so if we look at the Firebase documentation, you'll see that there's actually a function here that basically tells us when the state has changed for a user, and we also need to detach the listener as well when the view disappears as well. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to handle the state change. Now, in terms of the did change listener, we don't really need to add it because this service class is never actually going to be removed. It's something that's always going to be present. So you don't really need we don't need to add this in our example. But if you had a screen where it's not always on the screen, pause. So if you had a screen, or if you have an object that you know can be removed later on because you might dispose of it or it might be dismissed, then you probably want to implement the function here to remove the did change listener. So we're going to add this in now. So let's do that now. So in order to use that handler, what we actually need to do is we actually need to import Firebase Auth. So let's do that now. And then let's create a property. So what we'll do is we'll actually create a property inside of our protocol for this. Right, cool. So what we'll do is we'll create a property in here for our Auth handler. And then within the classes initializer, what we'll actually do is we'll actually set up our handler. Right, cool. So we've basically got our function called setup Firebase Auth handler, and we're using that in our initializer. And what we're basically saying here is after we assign the handler, we're basically going to check the user. So if the user is nil, then we're going to assume that you're logged out. And if it isn't nil, then you're logged in. So the way this works is that if this user object comes back as nil, then it means that there's no user, so you're logged out. So what we need to do now, is based on the user that we actually get back from the handler, we actually need to create a function that basically updates the user details with the data from the database. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. So what we've basically done here is we've basically created a function because we don't want this to get crazy. So we basically created a function called handle refresh. So what this is going to do is you're basically going to pass in the user ID, and then this will basically reuse the and then what we'll actually do is we'll access the Firebase database to get the user with the user ID, and then we're basically going to get the values out of the snapshot. So we're going to retrieve the first name, last name, occupation from the dictionary that we saved before, and then we're on the main thread. What we're going to basically do is we're going to set this property so that we can make sure that our UI updates on the main thread. So as you can see, obviously we separate this out into its own function so that we don't make this too big and it doesn't get big and confusing, so it reads nicely. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to use our session service implementation to actually handle switching between the logged in view and the main view of our app. And we're also going to handle setting the user details and doing logout. So let's do that now. So what we need to do is we need to go to our main app here, and then at the top here, what we're going to do here is we're basically going to create a state object for our session service. Okay, cool. And then what we're going to do is, like we said at the very start of our presentation before, is we're going to use the state from our session service to decide which view should appear. So whenever the state property changes, what's going to happen is that SwiftUI essentially is going to cause a redraw and actually change between either our login view or our main app view. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. And now what we need to do is we actually need to inject our service into our home view so we can actually get the user session details and assign it to those text fields that we had and also handle logout. So in order to actually pass this through the views, we're actually going to use something called an environment object. So what the environment object allows us to do is it basically allows us to pass data between a parent and the child view, pass this session service into our home view so we can access the user details and handle logout. So let's do that now. So what we're going to do, first of all, is we're just going to basically just do the placeholder for this. So if you just go into your home view, we actually need to create an environment object here. As you can see, we've created that now. So use the @environment variable property wrapper. And whenever you define it like this, the next thing you should always do, in my opinion, is to set it in the previews, because if you don't do this, the app will crash in the previews. So let's just set that now. So we're just going to say environment object, and then we're going to say session service implementation. All right, cool. So now that we've done that, so what we need to do now is we basically need to use our logout function and assign it here. So I'm just going to delete this to do, and instead of that I'm just going to say session service dot logout, and then what we're going to do is we're going to actually write a logic to handle logging someone out. So in order to do that, all we need to do is go into our session service, and then we just need to use the auth sign out. All right, cool. So we're going to call the auth function sign out, and we're going to mark it as an optional try. So if it does fail, then essentially it will just be nil, nothing happens. And then let's go back to our home view, and we're actually going to bind our user details to these text properties that we have here. So let's do that. So now we've actually got that, and we just put NA if this is nil, because it might not be available, it might be empty from the database. So now what we need to do is we actually need to essentially use that environment object in the root so we can actually pass it in. So essentially what we're doing now is we're now linking, so this is the bit where we basically link our parent, which is our app here, to our child, which is home view. So we inject it into home view, our environment object. So in order to do that, we should say home view dot environment object dot session service. All right, cool. So now that we've done this, we should have it where if you successfully register and create an account, the app will take you to the login screen, and you'll actually see your login details appear once it retrieves it from the database. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to run this on the simulator. Okay, sweet. So you can see it here. So we're just going to tap register, and we're going to enter in some details. So for the email, I'm not going to use my actual email. I'm going to use this site called temp-mail.org, which just basically gives you a temporary inbox. So I'm going to copy the email from here and paste it in. So I'm going to set a password. And as you can see, because we use the secure entry field password, you can't see the input that you're typing in. I'm just going to enter some details in here. Then we're going to sign up. And as you can see, when we sign up, it takes us into the app, and it basically gets all our details here. So where can you see this information? So if you go into your console in Firebase, if you go to authentication, you'll see now under the users tab, there's a brand new user using that fake email that I used here, and there's a user ID, and it tells us when the account was created and when we last signed in. And if we go to our real-time database, you'll see that we now have our users node here, and within our users node we have the user ID, and we also have all the information associated with that user. So now let's just test what happens when you actually hit logout. So if we hit logout now, you'll see that it switches and takes us to the login screen. Perfect. So now what we need to do is we need to handle two more cases. So we need to handle the login case, and we also need to handle forgot password, where someone actually resets their password. So what we're going to do next is we're going to handle login and then forgot password. So let's do that now. Let's go to our login feature. So we're just going to go to feature login, and then we're going to create a new model. And then we're going to create a model called login credentials. Okay, cool. And the reason why we've made these variables and not constants is because we're going to use this later on in our view model to basically bind the input that someone types in a text field and secure entry to our struct. So now that we've done this, let's actually build our service class. Cool. So we've got our function here, login with credentials, and sorry, I had a brain freeze. And then basically what we have is our publisher, and it's similar to our registration, where this time obviously, you know, if there's success, we kind of gonna use our session service to manage the user's details changing, and also the change happening between the two different screens, so we don't need to return anything. And we've got our error, which is gonna handle any errors. So now what we need to do is we actually need to implement our protocol function and implement the Firebase logic to basically log someone in. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. So what we've had to do is we've had to import Firebase Auth, and then we're going to use the Auth singleton class from Firebase to basically sign the user in with their email and password. When we get a response back, if there is an error, so if the error has a value, we unwrap it and we basically send pause. And if there's an error, we basically send the error through the promise. And if there's success, then we just basically send void. So we essentially just don't send anything. So what we need to do now is we need to write our view model, which actually uses this. So again, in login, let's create a new group called view model. Okay, cool. So I've imported Combine. We have our enum login state for successful, failed, and not available, similar to registration. We have our view model protocol implementation. So we have a function login. We have a property service for our service that we're going to inject. We have our state for the login state that we're going to use to basically listen to when a login was successful or not. We have our credentials where we're going to actually hold the credentials that someone types in. And we have our initializer for injecting our service into our view model. So what we need to do now is similar to what we did with our registration details struct. On our login credentials, we're going to create an extension with a static property called new, so we can just basically create a new login credentials in line when we actually write out the rest of our view model. So let's do that now. So it's the exact same as our registration details that we did before. So now let's actually implement the class. Right, cool. So we've got our view model implementation here with an observable object because we're going to use this view model as a state object. We've got our protocol implementation. So we create two published variables, similar to what we did with our registration view model, where we have the state and the credentials. So our default state will be not available, and we're going to use our login credentials.new to just basically create a new object for our login credentials. We have our subscriptions, which is going to hold descriptions for the publisher that we're going to work with in a second. And we simply just inject our service using dependency injection, so we can inject our implementation into here. So what we need to do now is actually use our publisher that we created a second ago, so we can actually log someone in and set the state depending on the result of that publisher. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. So similar again, I'm guessing you're starting to see a pattern here. So we basically do the login function with our publisher. We basically get the value via sync. If there's a failure, then we'll basically set the state that it's failed. If it was successful, then we'll basically get the state and then set that it was successful. We just use our subscriptions to basically keep this alive, obviously. Okay, cool. So now what we need to do is actually use this view model in our login view so we can actually see what happens when we actually log back in with the account that I created. So what you want to do is go into your login view, and then we'll go create a state object for our view model. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. So now we have our state object view model, and now what we need to do is we need to actually bind our email and password fields to our view model so we can actually get them and use it when we want to log in. So in the first one here for email, we're just going to use our view model and then access the email. All right, cool. And then finally, in our login button, we need to actually call the function to actually log someone in. So like similar to registration, we're binding the values into our view model, and then when someone actually hits this login button, we'll perform the action to actually log them in. All right, cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this on the simulators again, so you can just basically get a better view, because I know my head's kind of blocking the Xcode previews. And then we're going to test out logging in with the account that we just created before. And I'm going to enter my password. And then we're going to log in. As you can see, it logs me in and it pulls my details from Firebase and sets it to the view, because we've added our session state service that is basically bound to these text objects. So whenever we update that, this will get updated. And if we hit log out, it takes us back to the login screen. Sweet. So we have one more action to handle, which is forgot password. So when someone wants to reset their password, I basically just want to send them a reset email and they can reset their password via Firebase. It's a default email template. So what we're going to do is we're going to do that now. So similar again, let's go back into our project, and then we're going to go into our forgot password, and then we're going to basically go into here and create a new group called service. Right, cool. So let's break this down. So we basically got our forgot password service. We have a function called send password reset to email, where we're just going to pass in a string, which is the user's email that they input in the text field. And then we just got any publisher, where we basically use a void for the success and error for any failures. And then in our implementation for our class, we have a function here, obviously the send password reset function, and we have our publisher. But you'll notice this time with our deferred, it's not on the main thread. So why is that? So I don't know if you remember at the start, but I actually mentioned that this is kind of going to be fire and forget. So we don't actually need to update any UI when we actually send this request off, because there's nothing that's going to be bound to. We kind of just want to send the request in the background. So if you receive the email, then great. And if you don't receive the email, then great. So that means that you don't have an account with us. So we don't need to observe anything back from the service, this is why we don't need to put this response back on the main thread. We can just listen to it asynchronously in the background. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to write the logic that comes with Firebase to basically handle password resets. And if we actually just look at the documentation quickly, we'll actually see that there's a function here called send password reset with email. So we need to use this function here from the documentation. So let's add this in now and then break it down. Okay, cool. So we have to make sure that we import Firebase Auth, and then we need to use the send password reset, and we're just going to use the email that we pass in through this function. If we get an error, we'll pass through our future publisher that there's been a failure, and if we don't, then we'll just basically send void in our success. So now let's write a view model for this. Right, cool. So we have our protocol here. So we have our password view model, forgot password view model, and we have our function to send the password request. We have our service or our forgot password service, email to hold the email that someone types in, and our initializer so we can inject the service into this class. So you'll notice that we don't have an enum, and like I said before, that's because this is going to be fire and forget. We don't really need to listen to the events or the publishers and set anything. So what we're going to do here is in our class, we're basically going to use our view model. And because we're going to use this as a state object in our view, we need to obviously mark it as observable object. And then we have our publish property. So we have our email and we set that to an empty string. We have our service that we inject, and we have our function, like we said before, to basically send off the request. So now we actually need to write the logic to actually send off the request. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So we have our service, and we're using our function from our service to send the request. We use sync to basically get the response from our publisher. So as you can see here, we've not marked these as weak because we're not actually capturing self, so we don't need to. We print out any errors. We also print out that the password request that was sent, if it got sent successfully and there were no errors, then we just basically print this out. And then we obviously store this in our subscription. So now we need to actually use this view model in our actual forgot password view. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. So now we have our state object defined with our view model and our service. So now we need to actually bind our email to the property inside of our view model. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. And now we need to basically actually add in the logic to basically call the function to essentially send the request. So let's do that. And then we'll delete the comment. All right, cool. So now we've done that. So now that we've added those in with the binding the email and actually calling the function to reset your password, we're actually going to run this again on the simulator and actually test out if it works with the password that I have. So let's go to forgot password, paste in the email, send the password reset request. All right, cool. So obviously we've not done anything to give us any sort of visual feedback, so it'll just act like it's just sent it. And if I go to my disposable emails, you can see here in the email list that I've actually got my request to reset my password from Firebase. So if I was to click on this link here, I can actually reset my password and whatnot. Now I'm not going to do this, but if I wanted to, I could. All right, cool. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to test something else out. So if I actually just basically get I feel like that page refreshed, so I've got a new email. Just going to take it from here. So one thing I've realized is that if we actually try to log in with an invalid password, so we don't actually get any sort of visual feedback that something's gone wrong. What we need to do now is we actually need to essentially add in some error handling for our login and our register. So if something goes wrong during those two instances, we get some sort of visual feedback to tell the user that something's gone left. So let's do that now. So in our login view model, let's go there. And in our protocol, we're going to create a new property called has error. Okay, cool. So we're going to basically use this has error to basically tell us if an error has occurred, and we'll actually use this to bind it to a modifier in our view to either show an alert or not. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. So now we create a published property so we can observe the changes to this property. So what we're going to do now is we're going to basically create a function that basically observes the state changes, and depending on the state change, we're going to set if an error has or hasn't occurred. So let's write this out now. Okay, cool. So what we're basically saying here is when on the state, we're basically going to observe it whenever the value for this changes on the state, we're going to map it. So if the current state is successful or not available, then the has error will be false. And if the state is failed, then the has error will be true. And then what we're going to do is we're going to assign the value that we get back from our map high order function, so either true or false, to has error. So what we need to do is we need to call this set of error subscriptions in the initializer. So whenever this view model gets initialized, we'll always be listening to the changes to our state. So underneath the assignment for service, let's just call setup error subscriptions. All right, cool. So now what we need to do is we actually need to use this has error property in our login view. So let's do that now. So what we're going to do is below the navigation title, we're going to use the alert modifier. Now I know obviously the WWDC week that is a new modifier in Xcode 13 that allows you to just basically present alerts, but I'm using 12.5 because we want to support 14 and 15 or even 13 if you want to. So essentially this alert modifier will basically allow us to return an alert onto the screen. So if there's an error, we're going to show this alert. So let's type this out and then break it down. Okay, cool. So what we're basically saying here on the alert is that if the has error is true, then we're going to show some content. So because our state is an enum, we have to access it like this, where we actually get the case out of our state, and we're going to return this alert on the screen. Now, if it can't cast the case for our state, then we'll just return some default alert that just says something went wrong. So you'll see here that we're actually using a localized description, but obviously if you have a different type, then you'd have to cast it. But obviously I'm just using a default error state. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to run this and just show you what this looks like. So let's do that now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my email in, remove the empty space, and I'm going to put some nonsense password in, and then try and log in. And as you can see, it tells me that the password is invalid or the user does not have a password. So it's telling me that password is incorrect. So now I'm going to actually put in my legit password. Cool. And you can see that it logs me in to the app. And if I hit log out, it logs me back out. So now what we need to do is we need to do the exact same for our register. So let's do that now. So let's go into our registration register view model. So what we're going to do is create a new property, has error again. Cool. And then what we're going to do is we're going to basically add in the same function that we had before. So I'm just going to copy this from my login view model. Okay, cool. So we're going to basically have our state and do the exact same thing again where we check if it's successful, return false or not available. And if it's failure, then we're going to return true and then assign it to has error. And then we're going to make sure that our state is a published property. And we're also going to make sure that our has error is a published property. And then what we need to do is call this setup error in our initializer, like so. Okay, cool. And then what we need to do is we need to basically go into our registration, so register view, and use our new has error property. So let's do that now. For the exact same as before, we're just going to use that. Okay, cool. So now let's actually test this out. So if I run this, if I go to register, so what I'll try and do is I'm just going to enter an email that I know is invalid. And you can see here it tells us that the email address is badly formatted, so we can't actually, register with that email. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to enter in some valid information. And then we're going to sign up with this new account. And as you can see, it pulls out the information from the new account. And if I go into Firebase and I refresh the screen, you'll see that my new information is here as well. If I go to the real-time database, you'll see that now we have a new node with the information and I can log out and I could do the process all over again. So we've actually added in error handling now to basically make our app a lot more reliable. So that's everything from me. We went through a lot of stuff. We went through login, registration, forgot password, session management, error handling, even Combine as well. And obviously there's been a lot of discussion about whether Combine's going to be completely replaced by async await, which I don't think is true. They both serve their own purposes, and you could even combine them together. That wasn't a pun. So I will have videos. Obviously, when Xcode is more stable with the betas, I'll do some more updates. What's new in SwiftUI and iOS 15 and Swift 5.5. But I'm not going to do that now whilst we're in beta 1. But that's everything from me today. If you enjoyed the video, then give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate it. Also as well, if you have any feedback on the video, leave a comment in the comment section below. As usual, if you haven't already, hit the subscription button. I'd really appreciate if you subscribe to the channel. And also if you tap the notification bell for any updates whenever I release a new video. That's everything from me. I'll catch you all in a bit. Deuces.